Hello, everyone, and thank you for attending this event sponsored by the Society of Professional Journalists New England Chapter. My name is Chloe Clark, and I'm here tonight with Howard Bryant. Howard Bryant has been the senior writer for ESPN since 2007 and has served as a sports correspondent for NPR's Weekend Edition Saturday since 2006. He has written for the Washington Post, the Boston Herald, the San Jose Mercury News, and the Oakland Tribune. He has also authored 9 books, including his most recent, Rickey, The Life and Legend of an American Original. Howard, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So to jump right into it, you grew up in Dorchester. When did you first develop a passion for sports, and when did you decide to pursue a career in journalism?
Well, I think that I've always been interested in sports. I mean, you grow up there. I mean, growing up in Boston in the 70s it was kind of impossible not to be into sports, considering the Red Sox were great, the Bruins were great, the Celtics were always great, the Patriots, well, they were the Patriots, and it's amazing to think that the Patriots are like the dominant team around when they were never really any good. And so, yeah, everybody was into sports. We were always into it from a reporting standpoint or journalism standpoint. I always knew I wanted to write. I didn't really know what course it was going to take. It wasn't until later, until I got to high school and we moved down to Plymouth, that I really started to think about journalism in college. And so by the time I got to Temple University, by the time I got to, I think, 11th, 12th grade, I knew that I was going to pursue some form of writing. I didn't think it was going to be sports writing. I actually wanted to be a political columnist. I grew up reading all the guys in the Globe, reading the Metro section, reading, Mike Barnacle and then the op-ed page and Bella English and Derek Jackson and Ellen Goodman and everybody. And so all of the politics stuff was what I was really, really most into. So pretty much when I went to college, I'm like dealing with my son now who's going to UMass in a couple of weeks, and he's completely undecided, and it's like, that's perfectly fine. I'm just one of those kids who sort of knew what they wanted to try and stuck with it. I never even changed my major. It's just what I wanted to do.
Definitely. Now, onto your biography. Did you know that Rickey Henderson would be your point of subject in writing that, or how did that come about?
Well, that's interesting too. I mean, I think that books are just organic. I think that they take so long, and to write a book, you really have to be immersed in that subject for so long. You have to really want to do it, and it's hard to think about a subject that you're like, yeah, I want to spend the next 3 years on. And so for me, after goodness, I think it was 2014, I was with the late great Hank Aaron down at the National Portrait Gallery in Washington, D.C., and he and I were doing an event, and Rickey and a bunch of Hall of Famers were there. It was Hank Aaron's 80th birthday, and we started talking, and I met Rickey's wife, Pamela, and she said, "Hey, I would like you to do, for my husband what you did for Hank Aaron." And I said, "I didn't do anything for Hank Aaron. Hank Aaron doesn't need my kind of help." But the point is that she is the one who was really committed to Rickey's greatness and really convinced that he was an underrated superstar, and was known more for all of the things that he did off the field in terms of his personality and sort of the strange stories, the true or false apocryphal stories about him, and didn't think that his career was being treated with the sort of historical respect that it deserved. And so, I wasn't really thinking about it at the time. And then as time went on, 2016, 2017, I started to really think about him as a subject, that maybe this would be the next one that I wanted to work on. And it was for a lot of reasons. One of the biggest reasons is that going through where we've been for the past decade, starting with the Trayvon Martin's death and going through Ferguson and all of the racial disturbances, all of the encounters with black people and the police, and so much of the types of subjects that I take on, I sort of felt like I was losing my own voice. I wasn't sure that I could hear myself anymore. How many more times can you write about protest? How many times can you write about police brutality and sports and kneeling and the rest of it? And it's not that these subjects weren't important. They're extremely important. It was just that I wasn't sure how much I was adding. I thought it might have felt like a law of diminishing returns. That, okay, the more you write about it, the less impact it has, the less people hear it. And so I just wanted to write something that I thought was fun. I said, I want to go back and sort of give myself a palate cleanse and step back and write about something that reminded me why I enjoy the games, and something that allowed me to sort of stretch out in a different direction, because my last two books, Full Dissidence in 2020 and The Heritage in 2018, and you're dealing with really, really heavy subjects. And I think I wanted to just lighten the load a little bit.
Definitely. Now, Tom Verducci of Sports Illustrated once wrote that there are certain figures in American history who have passed into the realm of cultural mythology, as if reality could no longer contain their stories. Johnny Appleseed, Wild Bill Hickok, Davy Crockett, and Rickey Henderson. They exist on the sometimes narrow margin between fact and fiction. So how did you go about reporting on Henderson's life, and did you encounter any roadblocks?
Well, I mean, the biggest difference between Johnny Appleseed and Wild Bill Hickok and everybody else that Tom was mentioning is that Rickey's still alive, and I covered Rickey. I covered Rickey in '98 with the when he was with the A's and I was with the San Jose Mercury, and so I covered Rickey on a daily basis for that one season. And so the biggest obstacle was Rickey himself. Rickey didn't want to do it. Rickey didn't really want to cooperate. It is a unauthorized biography. It's not an authorized. It's not with his cooperation. He agreed to sit down with me a couple of times and then didn't want to talk after that. And so obviously, and then of course Rickey did one of the worst things that you could ever do to a biographer, which is not only did he not stop talking, but then he also, called some of his closest people and told them not to talk to me either. So these are the things that are really, really difficult process-wise. So for me, those were the bigger roadblocks. When, I think that when you take on a project, you have to do a lot of prep work. There's a lot of things that you have to sort of overcome. There are a lot of things that you're going to have to consider. When I work on a book, I have what I refer to as my 5 steps of anxiety. And the first step was fine. Do you have an idea? Yeah, Rickey Henderson was the idea, and I thought it was a great idea. But the second step of the anxiety is, can you get the idea? Meaning, do you have the access to the sourcing? Do you have the ability to actually pull the book off in terms of what it's going to take access-wise and materials-wise to actually do it? And when I was working on my Henry Aaron book, Last Hero, that biography came out in 2010, I had 3 major issues with that book. The first was that I was born in 1968 and Henry Aaron was born in 1938. And so the last thing you want to do is take a 1968 approach to somebody black especially, who was born in the Deep South in 1934. You can't put your environment onto him. You've got to be really respectful of that, because life was so different for black people back then. The second issue I had with Henry was that I was born in Boston and he was born in Mobile. So once again, a northerner going down south, those folks are not always going to be that supportive in talking to you. They may not trust you with their story. They may not believe that a northerner is necessarily going to be able to have the sort of nuance and understand the complexity. Usually they think you go down there to make fun of them or to criticize them. And of course, the third thing to this other point was that Henry retired in 1976. I was 7 years old, so I never saw him play. So how are you going to describe him? How are you going to talk about his motions, his mannerisms, his movements? How are you going to describe his aura when you have no firsthand knowledge of it? Now, that's obviously not the biggest deal in the world. I mean, hell, people write books on Abraham Lincoln. Every year, a new book on Abraham Lincoln comes out. He's been dead for 150 years. So you have to figure those things out. In Rickey's case, those things weren't exactly the same. I saw Rickey play. I covered Rickey. I've spoken to Rickey. So that made that piece of it a little easier. I lived in Oakland for several years. I was out there for 10 years in San Francisco, in the Bay Area, in Oakland. And so some of those issues were a lot easier. The bigger challenge for that was not being specifically from Oakland. Once again, this is a challenge that you always have when you write about subjects that you're not personally familiar with. You have to make sure that you have the access to people who are willing to talk to you, who can really give you an idea of what it is. We all know what it's like when somebody tries to come in and talk about Boston and they get Boston dead wrong because they don't know it. So that's the basic challenge that happened with Rickey, and luckily there are plenty of people. And when I started my career out there, I started my career at the Oakland Tribune, and I was covering high school. So I was covering Rickey's high school, Oakland Tech High School, and McClymonds High School, and Oakland High, and Fremont and Skyline, and Castlemont, etc. And so those challenges for this book were nowhere near as big as the challenges on the Aaron book. The biggest challenge on this book was actually the pandemic, was the fact that I expected to have the same access that I always have when I cover. And I was going to walk into clubhouses and talk to people and be able to have the same sort of freedom of movement and sourcing that I've always had, especially with someone like Rickey, because Rickey played for 25 years. So then the pandemic hits, and now there's no access. The clubhouses are closed, the world is shut down, and now you're really relying on your Rolodexes and the access that your friends have, all your phone numbers that your other colleagues have, and doing book interviews all over the telephone is much, much, much more difficult than the face-to-face interviewing that I'm used to.
You touched upon access and truth. So there are certainly a lot of interesting storylines that followed Henderson in his career. How did you separate facts from fiction, and were there any interesting anecdotes that came about along the way?
Well, I didn't. One of the things that I felt was important with a story like Rickey is the fact and the fiction merge together. And so you don't separate them. You put them all into the story and you write it as a single story. And you can do some myth busting in there. There are some stories that are true and some stories that we really know are not. And that's sort of part of the story, that Rickey's personality and Rickey's life story has been so outsized that it's very, very difficult to tell the difference between fact and fiction, to the point where some people don't even care if the stories are true or not because they're so good. Like there was a story that was passed around that Rickey, when he was in his second year, I think, third year, got a $100,000 bonus check, and he framed it because he was so proud of getting his first bonus check. He framed it without cashing it. And so that's one of the legendary longtime Rickey stories. And that story can't be true, can it? I mean, who would do that? It actually is true. It happened. Rickey got a check, and the Oakland A's, the front office, the accounting department, their books were off by $100-something thousand, and they couldn't figure out where the money was. And they had to go back and trace, and finally they realized that Rickey had a check that went uncashed. And finally one of his friends had to go over to his house and said, "Hey, where's the check?" And he said, "It's up on the wall." And they look on the wall, and there it is. It's a framed uncashed check. So it sounds like an apocryphal story, but that one actually happened.
Do you personally have a favorite Rickey story?
Oh yeah, I mean it changes by the day, but I think one of my favorite Rickey story is probably when he was in high school. He's in the 10th grade and he's a great player. Everyone in the neighborhood, they all know Rickey's one of the best athletes in their neighborhood, if not in the whole city. And Rickey's a 10th grader, and they get a new baseball coach, and the baseball coach points at the players and points at Rickey and puts Rickey on the junior varsity. And he is the team. All the players are pleading with this new coach. No, that Rickey's great. Rickey's one of the best. We got to have him. He's got to be on the varsity. And the coach doesn't listen. He looks at Rickey. Doesn't look like Rickey's really that big. And they put Rickey on the junior varsity. And right before Rickey goes over to the JV field, he looks at the coach and says, "You must not know who I am," which is an amazing thing for a 15-year-old to say to a grown-up. But Rickey was so aware of how good he was. He knew as a 5th or 6th grader that he could play in the pros, and anybody, that doesn't happen, to be a 5th or 6th grader, you're 11 years old and think you've got the world-class talent to play in Major League Baseball. A lot of people talk like that, but very few 10-year-olds know that they're going to the big leagues.
Yes, definitely. And touching upon that talent, I know that in your book, you note that at the end of the 2001 season, Rickey had stolen 1,395 bases. And during that same period, the Boston Red Sox franchise had stolen 1,382 bases. So, how has the game changed since Henderson last played? And do you think it's for better or worse?
Well, it's an incredible stat to be able to steal, as one person, to steal more bases than an entire team over a 20-year period. That's unheard of. I mean, that's impossible. It's almost it is one of those stories that you would say if somebody said that to you, you would think it was a lie. You would think that it was an exaggeration. But I think that where the game has sort of changed the most is where people will look at the sport. Obviously, where Rickey played as a base runner and as a base stealer, that's the part that's changed the most. They don't steal bases the way Rickey did anymore. The running game is not the same in baseball. Baseball is much more it's a home run game now. And so when people always ask me, what do you think Rickey Henderson's legacy is? I always say to them, I used to think it was with all the other great leadoff hitters who followed in his footsteps. The guys like Johnny Damon or the guys like Kenny Lofton or some of those guys or Marquise Grissom, some of those great players. But these days, because the sport doesn't steal bases anymore, that they don't really advocate for Rickey's style of play, that I don't know if he has a legacy in that regard. I think Rickey's way more of a unicorn. He is completely unique now. And when you look at his records, nobody's going to touch those records. There's nobody in the game that's ever going to steal 1,400 bases unless things change dramatically in terms of how this game is taught, in terms of how it's marketed, how it's sold, and how it's executed on the field.
So over the course of learning about Rickey and his story, did this writing process open up further subjects or point of interest for you to pursue in the future?
Yeah, it always does, and books always do that. If a book does not open your eyes up to things other than what you went into it for, chances are you're either not curious enough or you missed a whole lot. And for me, one of the things that I really wanted to do in this book, or that became really, really obvious in working on the book, was this story of the Great Migration from the Deep South out west. And we talk about it in so many different ways. If you look at the history of Washington, D.C., or Philadelphia, or Boston, or Chicago, Detroit, everybody talks about the Great Migration, obviously 1910 to 1970, where you had this massive, the greatest movement of people in the civilized world. You have, over the course of that time, people like in Alabama, like when you would talk about sports, you'd talk about someone like Hank Aaron or all the great players that came out of Alabama. You look at Mobile especially. Hank came out of Mobile, and you've got Satchel Paige came out of Mobile, and Willie McCovey and Double Duty Radcliffe and all these great players. And when people talk about Alabama or Mobile, they would just, like Henry used to say all the time, it's just something in the water. We've just got great players. And it's really not true. In the case of Oakland, we just never talk about the effect of the Great Migration on sports. We just assume that all these black people lived there and didn't come from somewhere else. Whether you're looking at Los Angeles with Eddie Murray and Ozzie Smith and Eric Davis and Darryl Strawberry and all those guys, or in Oakland, those guys, the city itself produced these great players, but where did they come from? And you look at the migration from these great players, and you're looking at Texas, Louisiana, Arkansas, and their families, and Bill Russell. Bill Russell's from Monroe, Louisiana. Bill Russell ends up in Oakland, 2 blocks away from Huey Newton, the founder of the Black Panther Party. They're all from down south. Dave Stewart, the great pitcher, also from Louisiana. And so all of these guys are migrating. They're migrating west. And the great, great story of Oakland in sports is really rooted in the story of the migration, where black people are leaving the Deep South because of the violence, the lack of economic opportunities, the desire to start something new. In turn, that creates a dynasty in Oakland sports.
In previous interviews, you shared that the original title was Rickey Henderson and the Legend of Oakland. So was that because of this theme that you bring up of migration, or what was the significance that
Yeah,
suggested?
it was that, but it was also the fact that there is a legend to Oakland, which is incredible. You look at the number of great players that came out of that town for a city of 300,000 is incredible. That you have Bill Russell and Frank Robinson and Kurt Flood and Vada Pinson. That all three, all four of these guys, Bill Russell becomes arguably the greatest basketball player in history. You've got Frank Robinson, Vada Pinson, and Kurt Flood. These kids, all of them, played in the same outfield in high school. And within 5 years, they're in the World Series. Once again, this is within 7 years. This is amazing. It really is an incredible, incredible thing to have that much talent. I mean, when you're growing up in Boston and you grow up in New England, if one guy makes it, then it's really an amazing thing. Unless you're talking about hockey or maybe skiing, you might get some more players from New England. But if you're talking baseball or basketball, especially basketball, one guy making it, people talk about that person for years. But they had three guys who were in the major leagues in the same outfield. And then you do it again. You've got Joe Morgan, you've got Rudy May, you've got all of these great players and all these high school. That's why when you talk to Oakland kids growing up, they're far less impressed with the major leagues than we would be growing up in Massachusetts because they've seen so many of their friends go to the pros. That just doesn't happen in other places of comparable size. And then you have it again. You've got Rickey and Dave Stewart and Lloyd Mosby and Gary Pettis and all these great all-star players. They were on the same little league team together. I mean, that amount of talent in one place just never happens. Even in a place like New York City or Los Angeles, where you have 5 times the population, it just doesn't happen. And so that's one of the reasons why I called it the Legend of Oakland, because when you start looking at the list of players that come out of that little town, that little city, it's mind-blowing.
Definitely. So, as we wrap up this section covering your book, what do you hope the readers take away from this biography?
Well, to me, I always look at it this way. A book is written in 3 stages. And the first stage, the book belongs to the writer. And in the second stage, the book belongs to the publisher. And in the third stage, the book belongs to the world. And what I mean by that is in stage 1, it's yours. It's in the house. It's on your computer. And you write this in whatever direction you want to take it. Then when you hand it in, there are other pieces that aren't yours anymore. Now the book is in the hands of the publisher. The publisher has control over the title. The publisher has control over the cover art. The publisher has, a lot of control over the spine in terms of they've got the control over the design. So all of that production stuff is not yours. And then, of course, the third part belonging to the world is once you buy it, once it goes into the hands of the customer, it's out of your hands. It's up to the person who buys the book to decide what to do with it. They can read it. They can not read it. They can give it away as a gift. They can walk right past it and never look at it as though it never existed. And so it's hard for me to say what I want people to get out of the book. It's what they get out of it. It's not what I want them to get out of it. That I usually lose in that equation anyway, because when somebody reads it, they interpret things their own way. For me, obviously, the motivation for doing the book was to illuminate a really legendary player and a legendary time and a time period that I don't think gets talked about enough, which is the late 70s to the early 80s, where baseball and labor were in such strife constantly. And you have this phenomenal once in a lifetime player who really just obliterated the record book and was sort of a joy to watch.
So, as we switch gears to talk about your other book, Full Dissidence, Notes from the Uneven Playing Field,
Mm-hmm.
there examines, the legacy of racism in American sports, pop culture, and political life. So the book is broken up into a collection of essays, starting with What Colin Kaepernick Taught Us. Do you think Kaepernick made it easier for players to make a stand? And has America really absorbed what he had to say?
I think that in the case of Cap, the real issue, the real issue with Kaepernick was more, what's the best way to say it? I think that after I finished The Heritage, there was so much talk about new wording and sort of new phrasing that got into our language, and one of those phrases was athlete activism. Now we hear that phrase all the time, but I remember coming out of that book thinking, well, we talk about athlete power, but we look at someone like Kaepernick, and he's blackballed from his profession. He is vilified in so many different ways for doing essentially what this country has told us you should do, which is when you have a grievance, you should make your grievance heard nonviolently, and he did those things. And so how are we talking about athlete power? How much power does this man have when he pretty much lost his livelihood for opening his mouth? And we've seen it with him, and we see it with other players. And you see it with the Dallas Cowboys or the Patriots or some of the other teams that essentially threaten your livelihood if you speak. And so it's not as though he made it easier. I thought that these things were illuminated, that they were on the table, but it was very chilling, because you see the reason why I wrote that, the reason why I wrote that essay in Full D was because it was a reminder of how little power these guys actually have. That we talk about them as though they're these really inspirational subjects, and in a lot of ways that they are. But to me, one of the big pieces of that book, it really does ask the question, how much power do you have if you lose everything by talking? That's not power. And the other question that I wanted to, really bring up in there too was to remind myself and to remind people that it's really not the players who have changed this decade. They're getting a lot of the credit. But let's not forget that the players were following the people. It was average, everyday people who were out there marching and blocking traffic and blocking the airport and doing all of those things. And the players got involved. And that made it important, because the players hadn't gotten involved since the late 1960s on a social issue. But yeah, I felt like what I wanted to do in that essay was to remind people that it was the citizens that actually followed, and the players were really trying to figure out where they fit. And also, as much as we talk about power, what the players have is money. They don't necessarily have a great deal of power, because if you have power, then you can talk without sanction.
Yes. You talk about more the citizens leading the way. So how does the conflict of racial identity and athletic identity interfere with most of these athletes when it comes to speaking out and getting involved politically?
Yeah, there's no question that there's a narrative that takes place, and it takes place across the country. And the farther you get away from black people, the better you are. And this is something that nobody will articulate specifically because it sounds horrible, but it is actually how it works in practice. Why are we talking about Colin Kaepernick as a figure? It was because he was advocating for black people. That's the reason. Why is he not playing in the NFL? It's not because he spoke. It's because he spoke for black people. If Colin Kaepernick was taking a knee because he felt like we needed to save the whales and we're not paying enough attention, he doesn't lose his job. He lost his job because he said that black people were being treated unfairly by police who were getting away with murder. And that was enough to inflame the country, even though it's true. And so when you talk about players, whatever athlete we're talking about, there's always a conversation of getting them away from where they grew up, or the wrong crowd, or all of these things. You hear it in the different cliches, with Allen Iverson, he's got to get away from his crew. And when Phil Jackson referred to LeBron's group as a posse, even though they're not a posse at all, they're his friends. The implications are always there along the same lines, that somehow if you want to make it, you've got to distance yourself from who you are and where you're from. And you do this by not talking, or by talking about subjects in a manner that your league has decided is okay, which is some sort of charity or something that does not indict. If you indict this country for its racism, you will be in a lot of trouble. And that is really, that is the burden that black athletes have had for a century here, which is, I've said it over and over again, the black athlete is the most successful, the most influential, and the most visible black employee this country has ever produced. They're the ones. And some people will make the argument and they'll say, well, wait a minute. What about Prince? What about Michael Jackson? What about Beyonce? Fine. Perfectly all good candidates, musicians. What about Denzel? Actors, great. With one major proviso, one major caveat. And that is, white people have always allowed black people to entertain them. And you can go back to the 1920s or beyond, or go earlier. You can always go up on stage and see somebody black playing music or dancing or singing for white people. Sports is different. Sports required a movement. Sports is not the same, because in sports, if we can be on the same team, and if we can trade sweat together, and if we can play, and we can travel together, and if we can do all of those things, then why can't we live together and go to the same schools and intermarry and all of those things that undermine segregation, that undermine Jim Crow? This is the reason why there were so many laws in place to not have integrated competition, to keep black people from playing against white people. Because if you can do those things, if you can be teammates, and if you can win together, and if you can do, then why can't you be coworkers? Why can't you be classmates? Then the whole system collapses. And that's the reason why once you do get a Jesse Owens or a Jackie Robinson or a Joe Louis, and now a LeBron James or whomever, or a Renee Montgomery or Maya Moore, the implication is that, okay, well, now that you've made it, you're the ones who have made it. We need you to speak for us. And with the white athletes, they just get to be players. They just get to go out and either hit their ball with a stick or put their ball in a basket or whatever. But the black athletes are expected to actually talk geopolitics. They're supposed to be black leaders. And so their burden, because they're the ones who made it, is so much greater. And believe me, and if you're one of those guys that doesn't talk about politics, then you're going to hear it from black people too. Look at Michael Jordan. If you don't talk about this stuff, people will get on you. How come you don't stand up? How come you're not speaking out? And this generation has decided to really speak out. And so, yeah, they've got a racial responsibility in a way. And that's one of the ways that I ended the heritage, which is, it is my sincere hope that at some point that's not necessary, that they just get to go play ball. Why are we following LeBron James? He's not a doctor. He's not a lawyer. He's not a senator. He's a basketball player. But yet for our community, they're the ones we look up to, because they're the ones who have had the most access to the, to the top things that America has to offer because of their talent.
So with that burden that African-American athletes do have in competing against, white power and paternalism, do you see this shifting in the coming years, or what will it take?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I think one of the reasons why I titled the book Full Dissidence was because I didn't know. And after that book came out, there were so many people who said, well, why didn't you give us any suggestions? And why didn't you, where's the hope? Why didn't you give us a roadmap? Why didn't you give us solutions? And I would say, what are you asking me for? You live here. You tell me what the solutions are. And I'm not being obdurate and not being rude about it. I'm saying, look, we're in a place right now where it's really, really difficult to ask the aggrieved people to answer your questions for you. You guys run the whole country. What are you asking me what to do for? So, yeah, it's a tough place, because what we're finding is that there is a small group of people, and the players are a huge part of this now, that you hear the terms all the time about getting a seat at the table. And maybe you'll get a seat, and whatever that means, what you're going to get is money. That's one thing. If there's one thing that this country will do, they'll pay you. Now, whether or not you're going to have the type of power that can prevent you from being blackballed for speaking your mind, it's a really good question. But the one thing that we do know with these athletes, and the one thing that we have seen, is that they're going to make a ton of money. They're making more money than they've ever made before. And what that translates to is we'll see. I don't think it's necessarily going to translate to anything more than money, because everything else is getting even more expensive around them. And so everyone's talking about LeBron James now finally being a billionaire, which is great for LeBron James. And it's one of the questions that I brought up at the end of The Heritage and also in Full Dissidence as well. What happens when the protester becomes the power? Do our situations change just because LeBron James is in charge? Maybe, maybe not. What happens now that what does it mean? And I think it's because we're so desperate, because there are so few black people in these top positions, that we conflate protest and progress. Like, what is the what happens when the protester becomes the power? Now, does it, if now that LeBron James owns a piece of Fenway Sports Group, or that Dwayne Wade owns 1% of the Utah Jazz, or that, that Magic Johnson owns 2% of the Dodgers, what does that have to do with justice? What does that have to do with activism? So you essentially now have some more black people in the billionaire class. That doesn't mean that the average everyday person is going to receive more fair treatment. You know what I mean? But we call it progress because, when you look at the Rooney rules and you look at hiring and everything else, so many black people aren't getting opportunities there as well. So on the one hand, I get it. Yeah, it's great that those guys have opportunities. But on the other hand, if you're looking at the full scope of people, and you're looking at structural racism and systematic racism and those types of things, I think they're two totally different subjects.
Definitely. And you brought up the Rooney Rule, which made me think about how, we're in this kind of performative era in sports, and many sports teams and leagues are trying to take steps to acknowledge their racist past. But do you think such actions are genuine and moving towards the right direction, or more performative, as I mentioned?
Well, I mean, I think anytime that you talk about history, and anytime that you sort of acknowledge, and everybody, I'm not just talking about making white people feel bad about themselves. I'm talking about when a place acknowledges what it is and where it comes from. I think there's something good about that. Everybody has a right to their life. Everybody has a right to the story that they want to tell, to the story that they remember, that they believe to be true. One of the reasons why I got into journalism in the first place was was watching basketball games, watching Celtics games, and then reading the story the next day in the paper, and saying, that's not what I remember as the most important part of the story, or reading about the Stewart case, or reading about Boston, and reading about Dorchester, and saying, these aren't the things that I would emphasize. So I want to be part of media so I can emphasize the things that I think are important. That's a lot of power. That's a lot of responsibility. But at the same time, I think that it depends on what you do with it. And right now, what we've seen, and I've been saying this for a long time now, I don't believe that protest nor patriotism should be for sale. And everything that we see right now, so much of it is used as a branding exercise. And so if it's more than that, if it actually has some form of public utility, then I think that's a really, really good thing. But if you're going to use protest, to sell T-shirts or to increase your brand, then I see it as useless as anything else. I see somebody in the chat has a question about Charles Barkley, but I couldn't read it. Where is it? There we go. What did I think about Charles Barkley's athletes are not role models, and would it stand if someone... it's a really great question, and I will say yes, it will stand today, tomorrow, and forever, to paraphrase George Wallace. Because Charles Barkley gets away with everything. He can say whatever he wants. He's one of the few people who just is sort of Teflon in those ways because he's so likable. People love him. And he is so authentic. I think what he was trying to get at, and I've talked to him about this a gazillion times, what he was really trying to say was, you are asking too much of us. That's what he's really saying. I'm not a role model thing. It's saying, look to your communities, look to your parents, look to your friends, look to other people. We're not that important. And a burden is being placed upon us that we can't sustain and that you shouldn't want us to sustain. I really like that message. At the same time, you cannot deny the fact that in this country, in this culture, we look to the famous people. Always. Black, white, Asian, Latino, whatever. We look to famous people. Famous rich people. Why do we listen to Oprah Winfrey? Because she's rich. Why do we look at Donald Trump? Because he's rich. Why do we look at Mark Cuban? Because he's rich, right? Elon Musk and whomever. So, and that includes LeBron James, and that includes Aaron Rodgers and any other superstar athlete. So it's what we do in the celebrity culture. But I agreed with him, and I still think, as I was saying before, that it should be unnecessary, but it's not. And think about the and think about the type of the way that we talk about things. Right? The guys who made it. We talk about dead or in jail with these athletes. If it weren't for sports, I'd be dead or in jail. I mean, and we use that narrative and we sell that narrative. So how can they not be important? So they're always going to be the ones we look to because, it's like I was saying, I've always said this, that if dead or in jail is as good as we've gotten after all this time, then we failed. I see a question in here too about Rickey. Rickey enjoyed his time in Boston. Rickey in Boston was fun. I mean, I think that he wanted to play more, but he was also 43 years old. And so, I think that it's so funny when I even bring up the fact that Rickey played for the Red Sox. A lot of people have forgotten he was there for one season. But that season was a very strange season. It was the first year of the Henry Group owning the team, and the team was in serious transition, and it was just sort of a 1 year thing where the team actually wasn't that bad, but they weren't playoff bound, and then that was it. It was sort of a weird year. And then, of course, Theo takes over at the end of the year for 2003, and then everything changes, and then they get Ortiz, and then the rest is history. Somebody says, I grew up in Boston during the busing era. What impact did it have on me? Huge impact. How can it not? I think that when we all grow up during our period, we all protect our time. And whether your time is World War II or the Cold War or 9/11 or busing, you remember these things. These things do shape you. And busing is another reason why I got into journalism. It was absolutely because of the way that busing was portrayed. It was who tells your story is as important as the story itself. Who gets to do the talking? And who gets to do the telling? And whenever you read about busing, when I was a kid reading about busing, it was always through the lens of Southie, always through the lens of of white people who felt that we were being pushed upon them. They used to call it forced busing, and the Louise Day Hicks thing and all of that stuff. It was always written through their lens about what is being taken from them, instead of the fact that you create a segregated society in Boston, and you're giving Boston kids books that don't have pages in them, and their schools are garbage, and they're not being given services and all the things that they need to succeed. And I was a kid during that time, and we went to Metco. I didn't go to school in Boston because of that. My parents put me in Metco, and I went to school in Newton. And then we left Boston altogether. Why? Because of busing, because of the schools. So it's had a massive impact on my life, no question about it. Question. Rickey played today. Do you think his numbers would change, or was he stealing bases anyway, being confident in himself? Great question. I asked Billy Beane about this, and I said to him, he said, well, with our advanced numbers, Rickey's even more valuable now than he was before, when he played. But I think that he would be closer to Mike Trout than he would be to the old Rickey Henderson. He says that Rickey's got, he doesn't have Trout's power, but he's got enough power to be a power hitter. He would probably hit third and not first. We would probably change some of the stats in each column. We would probably de-emphasize the speed and emphasize more power. And so I started thinking to myself that to have Rickey not be a leadoff guy, to have Rickey not steal bases at the same volume that he did, To have Rickey emphasize power and not speed is to not quite have Rickey Henderson. So to answer the question, I think if Rickey played today, I think the numbers would be there. I would hope that his sheer force of personality would allow him to be the player that he wanted to be. But the culture of baseball right now would not allow Rickey Henderson to even attempt 130 bases, never mind stealing 130 bases.
There's no more questions. I can ask on the note of your book, you talk about the lack of diversity in journalism. Do you think the industry has gotten better, and what impact does this have on receiving news?
Well, eventually, you would think that it has to. Obviously, the world has changed since George Floyd's murder. And so you see people getting more of an opportunity, and you see that there has to be change. That doesn't mean that it's anything more than performative. And as I've always said, that the idea of diversity and whatever else you want to call it, DEI, whatever the new terms are, is always to be better. It's always to get better. It's always to have the perspectives of different voices that make your work better. And diversity of color without diversity of thought doesn't really do a whole lot for me. I mean, it does a lot for the individual, because those people get to have jobs and careers and families and the rest of it. They get to put, food on the table. That's really, really important. But if you're not having the broad discussions of thought, if you're not having these conversations where you are really examining who we are and where we've been and where we're going from different points of view, then it goes back to what we were talking about earlier. Then you're simply shifting the columns of who's going to get money, but you're not going to necessarily move a culture forward.
We only have a couple minutes. I don't know if there's any more questions in the chat that anyone would like to add.
Going once, going twice. What did I hope people would get from Full Dissidence? Same question as before. I mean, I don't know. I mean, I write stories that I want to read. And sometimes you write things that you just feel need to be said. And I just felt like where we are right now as a culture, I wanted to sort of examine that culture. I'm hoping that what people see when they read the work that I do is, more than anything else, I hope that they feel empowered to disagree, agree, have a thought, explore, expand, just to say what they feel is what they want to talk about. And on top of that, to do it with facts behind you. I mean, I don't care about people's opinions. I care about whether or not you've got something to say based on the research and the truth of what's out there. Then there's a lot to talk about. If it's all just opinion, then there's no value to any of it.
Perfect. Well, that wraps things up. Before the end officially, is there anything else that you would like to add in regards to this conversation tonight?
No, just thank you. Thank you for doing it. It's always good to talk to young journalists and to really be to try to be useful. So thank you for having me.
Thank you for your time. I really appreciate your insight and knowledge.